All right, everybody. So we are going to talk about the most common mistakes in React in 2023. So I'm just going to fire up the slides and we will dig in here. Now, this talk is based on my experience, and my experience comes from, well, frankly, about 10 years of working in React now. It blows my mind that React's been around this long, but in particular, as a React consultant, I have worked with literally dozens of companies over the years. And this is lessons learned along the way because I do a lot of code reviews. And through those code reviews, I've taken little notes and noted a lot of things that I see that seem to be common issues that can bite people. So when we talk about this dumpster fire of potential problems, it doesn't fit in our time today. So I want to be clear, although there's all these different sections that we can talk about, I don't expect to get through all of this. I may jump around a little bit, but I just want to show a number of issues that I've seen. And the other thing is, don't worry that I'm not going to get through all of this. I will share the slides. I'll post them online, share them with the hosts so that you can read through some of these on your own. You'll notice these slides are quite simple. They really just share basic setups. In some cases, I share out to tweets where I've talked about some of these concepts. Okay. So I want to begin just with a conversation around foundation in the first place, because anytime that you're going to create a React app, you have this decision about how to get started. And that decision isn't necessarily easy. Now, I've got the big five in here, and I've put them on the chart simply because this is the first decision that we need to make, and it's not trivial. This has big implications on the way that we write code. And I point this out because there's a few interesting things that you'll notice right away. An inflection point occurred back in 2023 where you see the yellow line, which represents Create React App, has finally been eclipsed by Next, which is the red line that you see. And you'll notice that since 2023, Next's growth has been amazing. It is really meteoric, and it is also interesting that since that time, we're starting to see the decline in Create React App. And one thing that you might not realize is that's a very logical thing to be happening with Create React App because Meta no longer pays people to support it. So I no longer recommend people using Create React App. I recommend using Vite instead. And that's the other rapid growth story on this chart. You can see Vite is the orange line down there, and Vite's growth is also huge. And it looks like we may not be that far off from seeing Vite being more popular than Create React App. This wouldn't surprise me. If you today are on Create React App, I would suggest pivoting to Vite because it's the sort of thing that tends to be highly practical. I've helped a number of my clients do so, and it takes usually a few hours for me. Now, this can get more complicated if you end up having a lot of customizations. If you've ejected from Create React App, then it's even hard to estimate. Then the sky's the limit on how different it might be from Vite. But if you are using plain Create React App, it's pretty easy to pivot to Vite. I have also helped companies pivot over to Next.js, and they've generally been quite happy about that. So those are clearly the big two. But I'd also emphasize Remix continues to be very compelling and frankly is quite easy to pick up because of its embrace of web standards, which I really love. So that blue line down there at the bottom, it's not really ticking up in the way that I expected yet, but I'm wondering if at some point that's going to magically happen. It's just hard to guess whether Next is going to continue to have this clear advantage in popularity. But one other story that's on here is you just see Gatsby, for whatever reason, has never really caught on and just continues to be rather flat. There's some various ways I could speculate on this, but frankly, in the end, I think it's really just a matter of some of its past baggage and reputation. There was a time that it was viewed as slow and things. So those are some things there. But I do recognize that Gatsby continues to innovate too. So at some point we might see the story there change as well. And also, this is not an exhaustive list, but I bring it up because foundation is absolutely key. Now, the reason that I say that it's a mistake to be using Create React App in 2023 is there's just so much more good stuff that exists in competing options out here. You look at all the green checkboxes under Next.js and under Remix. And in fact, I even need to update this a bit because it's hard to keep this sort of a slide updated because things are constantly changing and innovating in this space. Now, if you're considering moving over to Vite, just recognize there's lots of benefits to doing so. But frankly, the big benefit is performance and using more modern tooling. You really feel that right away when you go over to Vite. It tends to scale very well. And it also, you may not realize, actually has a fundamentally different architectural approach because it is sending ES modules to the browser. So we don't have to wait for all of our JS to get glued into one JS file and then shipped over to the browser. That's what Create React App does. With Vite, it is sending those ES modules over. So it's just fundamentally a faster experience. Okay, another little foundation mistake that I often see is having separate repositories for related code. And I'd encourage you to think about a monorepo. I've found monorepos to be really useful for grouping code together that changes together. And this might be the case where you've got a React app and then you've got a backend for front end. I use the term BFF for short there. And the reason that I say this is often your backend for front end and your React app are going to need to change at once. They're going to need to change in lockstep. You're going to, for instance, add new features on the back end and then want to build a UI to work with that on the front end. It might be nice to do that within a single pull request. And you can do that if you're in a monorepo. Monorepo also encourages interacting together. And there are lots of ways to do monorepos. My favorite is using workspaces combined with Turbo Repo, which is a project from Vercel. But also NX is another popular way to do so. I would just encourage, though, think about whether we could use monorepos to actually encourage teams to collaborate. They are a tool to get teams to work together. And if we have things that are separated by repository, what tends to happen is each of those teams tend to work in isolation and not necessarily communicate as well as they can. So combining related code can be really useful. And I've just found this helpful in React. Another little conversation about foundation, not using TypeScript, Zod, MSW, etc. So I've mentioned multiple things here. Let me start with TypeScript. Here's a little story. A few years ago, let's rewind, I'd say 5 or 6 years ago, I was very against using TypeScript in React. And the reason I was is because, frankly, the story 5 or 6 years ago in TypeScript wasn't near as good. The editors weren't as strong. The types weren't as good. There weren't as many people using TypeScript in React. So it was harder to find examples. It felt like we were swimming against the stream. And when you fast forward to 2023, all of that is inverted. Now, if you are using plain JavaScript, you're actually swimming against the stream. It is more common by far to see teams using TypeScript now. I went from years ago, when I was doing consulting and training, I was very rarely finding any teams that knew TypeScript at all. Whereas today, probably 95% of the companies that I work with are using TypeScript. And of those that use it, they pretty much universally love it too. So it's become a very easy decision in React. So I'd highly encourage using it. Now, I also mentioned Zod. Zod is a library that does runtime validation. Something to keep in mind with TypeScript is TypeScript only runs at compile time. So TypeScript does not manifest in the browser. So the places that Zod is useful is at the edges. And when I say edges, think about all the places that you might want to validate data that is uncontrolled by TypeScript. So let's think of some examples. The URL, I might have URL parameters and I want to validate that this is a number or this is a string or this is an enumeration of particular values. I might read data from local storage and I want to validate that it's in a proper format. I might get data from an API and want to make sure that that API is returning the JSON or XML that I expect. So Zod makes sure that I'm getting what I expect from those out of band interactions, from the edges of my application that TypeScript cannot control because it comes back at runtime. The other thing that's really nice here is once I have that control, now my application can fail fast rather than fail slow. Now, when I say fail fast, people sometimes look at the idea of Zod and they might say, well, I'm doing this thing at runtime and I'm really unclear what this buys me because my app is still going to crash if I don't get the JSON that I want or if the data in the URL is malformed. Yes, but you've probably heard this saying before, fail fast, fail early. And that is what Zod lets me do. Zod allows me to fail the very moment that something happened that wasn't expected. And what you tend to find is Zod will find these things during development because development is when I want to know that the JSON that I got back is not what I expected. The application may quietly limp along and still work. But with Zod, I find out immediately that I didn't get what I wanted. And then the application can throw a nice clear error and say, sorry, the JSON we expected didn't come back from the API. Or the argument in the URL, we thought it would be a number and it turns out it's a string. Those sorts of things. Okay, last one in this list, MSW. MSW stands for mock service worker. I use this tool just about everywhere. So what mock service worker does is it mocks out HTTP requests so that they never leave your machine. So I can, for instance, code on a plane, code out in a field where there's no internet, code while I'm on a subway, places where I can't get internet, I can still code and code reliably. Now, I just made it sound like it's merely for flaky internet connections. What it's actually about is imagine that you could code day to day and your application is hitting mock data that is 100% reliable and 100% local. That's a game changer. That is huge because it means that there is no way that I come in on a Monday and I can't code. If my laptop will boot, then I'm ready to roll. I can actually work. And that's massive. So many times, if I don't have mocks, what I find is I am inhibited because an API is down, authentication has some sort of an issue, we're dealing with slowness and flakiness. I don't want to have to deal with that when I'm trying to solve a particular UI problem. The infrastructure is really secondary. It can be a black box for me, out of sight, out of mind. And that's what I get if I use MSW. And if you've ever used a tool like Express, you'll find MSW feels pretty relatable. You end up saying, when this URL is called, return this hard-coded JSON instead. So my suggestion is use these things. Another thing, if you're going to be using TypeScript, I highly recommend using TypeScript ES Lint. TypeScript ES Lint has all sorts of good stuff in it. And if you're going to use TypeScript, I encourage you, configure it with TypeScript ES Lint and use it heavily right up front. The thing that I'm dealing with lots of my clients is if you don't set up things like TypeScript ES Lint up front and strict mode and all these things, you end up with a React code base that is unfortunately hard to change later because you can end up with, for instance, thousands of innies in the code base. One of my clients had over 1,300 and we've slowly moved them in the direction of better types, but it takes a long time. So enforcing these things programmatically early on can be really helpful. There's also this interesting mistake that can happen with types where you over specify types. And recommend only specifying what can't be inferred. If you're working in TypeScript, just specify when necessary. Use type inference when you can. That tends to save you keystrokes, save you work, helps you move faster. This one happens in React all the time, and more broadly, anytime you're working with TypeScript, is lying to TypeScript. And my suggestion is to be honest with TypeScript. And let me come out of here for a second because I actually want to click on this link here and show you what I mean. I'm going to go to this hyperlink and we'll pop it over here. So this is what I mean by lying to TypeScript. This has been on my mind a lot lately. Sometimes you'll see this where you've got an API and it returns a 0. And that 0 is supposed to represent the lack of a value. The problem with that is it's a lie. That's not the truth. And lying to the type system reduces type safety and it makes things harder to read. What we should do instead is use null to represent a null value. And then our type system can make sure that we handle that null. See, the TypeScript system can't help us make sure that we handle a 0 effectively, but it will help us when we have a null. So use null to represent this state. And now we know that we'll actually have that handled. Okay, so back over here. Another mistake is, this is minor stuff, but exporting default on a separate line, people will disagree with me here. Calling this a mistake is too strong. I should just say, this is my preference is to use a function declaration, do that export default on the same line. I'm going to breeze past this because frankly, not that important. I have found it really useful though in React to have a consistent order to the way that I declare components. And I really do think this is important to convey as a team. I suspect your team has never had this conversation before, but you quietly have an unstated standard. So this is what I mean. I'm going to pop back out of here for a second and go back to this slide so that I can open this hyperlink. What I want to show is this is the order that I use when I declare React components. I like to have the state at the top. The reason I want the state at the top is other things tend to rely on that state, so it feels very logical to have it first in my components. Then after that, I will put derived state. And when we talk about derived state, this is another one of those very common mistakes in React is declaring state when we should actually derive the state. So this is a great example. Imagine that I want to have a list of active users. Well, one thing that I could do here is I could go ahead and declare another piece of state, and I could call that piece of state active users. The mistake with that is now I'm on the hook for making sure that I end up showing or end up keeping users and active users in sync. And that's not easy to do. That could fail at any point if there are multiple places that either of those end up changing. But by deriving this state on each render, I create a situation where on each render, this will be calculated. And so I know that the active users is always going to be valid because it's going to be derived from users. Now, this also brings up potentially a performance concern. You might worry, well, isn't this expensive to do on each render? Well, this particular example is not expensive at all. Calling filter this way on a small data set is really trivial. But if you hit a situation where this actually is expensive, that's where you can use memoization to help on that case. So React has memo built in. So I would just memoize any of these expensive calls. I would caution though, in my experience, a conversation about performance in React really should be peppered, or I should say, should have this foundation, which is I favor doing the most ergonomic thing first. And by that, I mean, do whatever feels most natural to you as a React developer, and that tends to work just fine. Then, if you end up having performance problems because, for instance, you're rendering often or you're dealing with huge data sets, that's when I start thinking about doing performance optimizations, but only then. And even when I do those, usually I can solve those performance issues by getting the state in the right spot. In other words, as low as I can. Okay, so I've kind of diverged from the point that I was wanting to make here about order of operations, but some things have come up along the way. So I said, I like to have state at the top, then I want to have derived state, and then I like to put other hook calls. So this might be, say, use effect, use callback, those sorts of things. Here I'm calling a custom hook called use logger. After that, I'll put in functions. And then finally at the button, or I'm sorry, at the bottom, I'll return JSX. But you'll notice, like, you don't have to do these in this order. I'll sometimes see this where I'll see React components where there's some state, and then there's some state down here, and there's some functions up here, and it kind of bounces around. I just find that harder to read because for me, I want to know what state is in the component first. It gives me a real good sense of what the component does, and then I can move on from there. So this little ordering tends to be helpful. I would encourage your team to have this conversation and decide what order makes sense for you. Okay, next up, let's switch gears and talk about JSX. The probably number one issue that I see with JSX is overlooking reuse opportunities. And if you are repeating JSX, that's a sign that you might want to create a component. If you're repeating logic, that's a sign you might want to create a hook. I love how simple React has made this. I have two primitives here, a component and a hook. And anytime that I'm repeating myself, I can reach for one of those depending on whether it's HTML or logic. So when I do code reviews, I'm often looking for this very thing. I'm watching for repeated JSX, I'm watching for repeated logic and seeing opportunities for custom hooks and components. This is the basics of React, but it's also something that's a good reminder, just this foundation to look for, because it's the sort of thing that you really can't automate this problem away with any tooling. You've got to use your own eyes. Some tools can at least point out what may be some repetition, but often this is the sort of thing that you need to find in a code review. Another thing that I've seen when we talk about JSX, if you're going to create reusable components, this problem of having a weak or a missing design system. The solution to this is to create a design system first. Now, I recognize I'm talking to a group that may not be familiar with design systems. That tends to be something that more designers fixate on. So, when I say design system, what I mean is typography, spacing, voice and tone, icons, images, colors, padding, and so on. All of that basically creates a target that we can focus on. It gives us something that we're all trying to achieve. And that is really important to have before we go down the road of creating reusable React components or any kind of reusable components for that matter. If we don't have a design system first, then we find ourselves trying to nail Jello to the wall. We don't actually know where we're headed, so we disagree. And over time, our components aren't actually that reusable because what you'll find is the design teams will actually end up switching around designs over time. They'll be inconsistent because they won't actually agree on what their target is. Something else that I look for is repeated map calls. In React, we use map all the time to be able to iterate over an array and display JSX as a result of that array. If you find yourself repeating map calls, try to do it once. Often you can. If you see a map followed by a map, maybe you could do one map and do the two together. You can eliminate a set of iterations by doing that. So another thing that you might see are separate small single use functions. This is kind of a funny one to have in here because actually that's generally recommended for various reasons. But when you have really small functions, like one line functions, then I lean toward inlining those instead. And I've got a little link here that will show a little more context there. So I'm going to pull this up. So this is what I mean. Up here, we've got this button and we have an on click and then it calls on click. And then up here, we do some stuff. Well, if doing some stuff involves one line of code, maybe calling a single set state or calling some separate function, my suggestion is to actually do it in line because every piece of abstraction that we add to our code has a cost. It has a cost in terms of more code, like we've had to declare another function, name that function, invoke that function. Mentally, I have to jump between this on click and then jump up here and then read what it does. There's some other costs to this. On click does not tell me what the developer's intent is. All it tells me is when the code runs. So it's not actually providing me any extra context either. Now, if this had some better name, then that might be helpful. But my general rule is this. If we're talking about one or two lines of code, then I tend to just prefer to inline it right here on the event handler. And if it gets longer, then go ahead and move it the other way. So there's a number of benefits to this. Less code, you get automatic TypeScript types, so you don't have to deal with declaring those types. The reader can actually read your code top down. And it clarifies that it's not reusable logic either. When we see a function that's only called once, it's a little confusing because now I actually have to go look. I go, okay, is this called from multiple places? No, it's just here to create a layer of abstraction. So not all abstractions are useful. Some are. And that's how I decide is just based on how much code is there. So as a little side note, my business is helping teams be more effective in React. So I travel all over the place. My consulting site is reactjsconsulting.com. This is me training a team, actually, oddly, in my hometown, which is pretty cool. They were right down the street. I got to ride my bike to go train some people, which is funny because like sometimes I get on a plane, other times I get on my bike. It's great traveling the world. So if your team wants help with this, please reach out. You can find me. So it's a little seventh inning stretch in here. Let's move on to state, which to me is maybe the most important topic as part of this conversation, because I think state and React might be the place that I see the most struggles. First one, separating related state. When I talk about separating related state, I mean, if you find yourself declaring multiple use state calls that are actually related to the same concept, it can be useful to unify that related state. So I'm going to, let's see, I got the wrong window here. Give me just a second to get out of here and find the right window. There we go. Okay. So let's put a little bit of state over here. I'm going to imagine that I decide to declare some state for a user. And I might say I've got first name and I have last name, and I'm going to store their age and their hair color, all these sorts of things. So at this point, I've got a bunch of state up here. Now, what I've done is I've declared a lot of state that's actually related to the same thing. It is all state about a user. So what I would recommend then is unifying all this down into one state call rather than 4 or 5 or 6 separate use state calls. The problem with this is, well, there's a couple things. For one is, if I'm going to go get a user from, say, a RESTful API or GraphQL, I'm probably going to get an object back. And it would be a lot easier for me to take that object and put it into a single piece of state than to have to split it up and store it in all these separate pieces of state. The other thing is, when I go to save this user later, I'm probably going to have to send a user object up to the server. So it's more convenient if I have all that in one object rather than in a bunch of separate state calls. So what I would suggest here is instead say user, set user, and then initialize the user with whatever properties this user has here. So now I've got one piece of state. I've got a lot less code. I don't have to break the object apart and I don't have to glue it back together. Just one object. And the other thing that's really nice here is this now tells everybody this is a concept. It's a first-class concept with a name and a type. So we all understand that first name, last name, email, and so on is described as a user. Whereas before with separate pieces of state, it feels more intimidating because it's a little unclear where these lines are drawn. This tends to happen, especially if you've got a page that's working with multiple domains where you think about, oh, okay, I have a user and I've got a product. And then we also have this contact form down here. So you can end up with state that really gets hard to understand. Okay, next up. Multiple use state calls in a row is another smell that I look for in code reviews. And this is where, and actually this is a typo. I shouldn't say use state calls in a row. I should say set state calls in a row. So I'm actually going to fix this just while I'm thinking about it here. And that way, when I share the slides with you all, you'll get ones that actually make sense. So I'm going to click right over here because I have a little example. And guess what it's from? Twitter. I tweet a lot, y'all. So it's worth sharing some of these. Okay. Here I am showing some unified state. And you can see we've got state that contains a user and is loading. Now, this puts two things together that are, in this case, not necessarily related on the surface, but you can see how I could create an object instead to eliminate separate pieces of state. And then back up here, I was showing just examples of how here we have multiple set state calls, and I'm calling set user and I'm calling set is loading. Well, instead, what I could do is use a reducer, and reducers are really nice because with a reducer, I can make one dispatch and then update lots of different pieces of state at one time. The other nice thing about a reducer is it completely protects that state in a way that plain use state calls do not. Now, I did a poll just the other day on Twitter about use reducer, and it really surprised me. Let me let's see, house core use reducer poll. I just want to see if I could just find it really quickly. I think this is it. Yeah, this one really surprised me. Okay. So this surprised me that about half of React developers never use reducer. And that is sad to see because it actually is a wonderful tool. It scales well. And if you're dealing with complex state, it can be quite useful. Now, you'll notice though that only 5% of React developers, and this is over 3,000 people on Twitter, only 5% said that they often use reducer, and about half here said seldom. They mostly use state. And to be frank, I am probably in this seldom category right here. I think use reducer is great, but it is a power tool. And if you use reducer for everything, to me, that's probably overkill. But I will say it is easy to forget that it's there because it's easy to just default to use state, but useReducer is actually a wonderful tool. So I'd encourage you to think about that in the future. Okay, let's bounce back in here. Oh boy, this one may be my favorite. I still see this all the time. Use effect is easily the least loved API in React, and that's because it's easy to mess it up and it's also overused, and the name is a little unclear for people. So I see all sorts of abuses of use effect. And I've actually gotten to the point now that when I do code reviews, when I see a use effect, I consider it a code smell. Now, I want to be clear about what I mean by code smell. Code smell does not mean that the code is bad. Code smell merely means that it's a sign that I should look deeper, that it is a strong sign that we might be doing something wrong. Because use effect is not fundamentally bad or it wouldn't exist at all. It's just in 2023, use effect is often the wrong choice because we have better abstractions and better patterns where we can accomplish the same thing. And this is one of the common examples is this idea of syncing in use effect, because what we can do instead is derive state. So I showed an example of deriving state earlier off that user where I could get the active users by just looking through the array of users. Other examples are, imagine that I want to have a header that says the number of records in the table. I shouldn't have a piece of state that stores the number of records because I already have the list of records in an array. So I can just run a dot length on that array. Simple. Now, those seem obvious, but trust me, when state gets more complicated, it can be really easy to accidentally declare state when in fact you could just derive that state from an existing example. And in fact, one example of this, I'll pop over here to Twitter for just a moment, because the thing that I want to show is an example of where I derive state that might surprise you. So I'm going to come over here to my profile. And on my profile, I have this tweet here pinned. And I have it pinned for good reason because I reference it all the time. This talk has some points in here, but the one that I want to show you is down here when I'm talking about handling form state. Forms in React are complicated. React really doesn't have strong opinions about how to do forms. It gives you some primitives that are sufficient. And this is part of why you see form libraries like Formic and React Hook Form that are very popular. I don't tend to use those though. I tend to use plain React because I found the combination of I found that I don't need a React form library. What I need is a pattern. And that's what I'm trying to convey on this slide. So this is the way that I think about it. I need to know what fields have been touched and I need to know the form status. So I have to store those as state. There's no way to derive that from anything else. I have to, after a field has been touched, I got to store that in state so that I know, okay, somebody has interacted with this field. When a form has been submitted or is submitting, well, those are unique values that are effectively an enumeration. It is one or the other. It can't be submitted and submitting at the same time. So I store that as a single field called status. And the form status is either idle when you first saw it, submitting while it's being submitted, submitted if it's been submitted but hasn't actually been completed yet. So those are some of the common states. These will differ slightly depending on your form, but generally you're going to see these sorts of things. Down at the bottom, though, notice what I say about deriving. I am deriving whether the form is valid, what the errors are, and then also whether the form is dirty. And I actually show how to do this in my Managing React State course. If you go out on Pluralsight, I actually just updated it this week. So it's interesting timing that I'm showing this here. But the one that probably surprises you the most is errors. You might think, I have to declare state to hold the errors for the form, and you don't, because if you think about it, you can tell what errors are on the form based on what data is entered into the form. So if you're storing the state for the form itself, then you can actually derive the errors based on that state. So for instance, I've got some state that stores the first name for this form field. And if it's empty, I know that it's an error because that field is required. So I actually will calculate any errors for that form on every render. And again, that might sound expensive. Maybe it is. It depends how complicated your validation logic is. But generally, you can make that approachable by uh, having memoization if necessary, but I tend to find it's just not necessary. The other thing that I do to make this approachable is I tend to use Zod to perform my validation. With Zod, I can declare the schema for my form and say this field is required. This field must have a length between 1 and 10 characters. This field's a number, and so on. So with Zod, I can just run a Zod parse on the data for my form and see whether it validates. It's quite slick. So that's what I mean by deriving state. I also just briefly want to show what I mean by state enumerations. This is an area in state that is easy to overlook. Watch out for state that allows illogical combinations. This state that I've shown at the top is an example because the mistake that I made here is I have 3 different pieces of state that should actually be one piece of state. And the reason that's important is it would be illogical for all 3 of those pieces of state to be true at the same time. What they actually are is that basically a state machine. You can be in one of those states at a given time. So it's better for me to instead have a single piece of state and then toggle the status between these different setups. So the rule here is strive to make the impossible impossible. Okay, next. Oh boy, fetching and use effect. This one probably makes some people cranky because I'm guessing anybody on here that's working in React much is saying, if you call this a mistake, then you're calling the last 10 years a mistake. Everybody fetches and use effect. And you're right. Lots of people fetch and use effect. And in fact, when function components added in hooks, this was the way to fetch, was using use effect. The reason that I say this is a mistake in 2023 is this. It's not my job to use effect for fetching anymore. And if I am, then I'm probably just making things hard on myself. There are so many good libraries that abstract use effect away for me. I want to emphasize, I am saying abstract it away because if I go use these libraries, they're still using use effect behind the scenes, but now it's not my problem. The foot guns that are built into use effect don't affect me anymore because I am using these great tools instead. Now, there are a lot of ways to fetch data, and this is not even an exhaustive list. There's React Query and SWR are very similar to one another. These are libraries that contain caching. They will automatically refetch when connections fail. They contain keys for clearing out those caches. You can mutate data with them. A really wonderful APIs in these tools. We also have React Server components, which have just recently come out and are supported in Next.js, soon to be supported elsewhere. That's another great way to do a fetch, and it doesn't require a use effect because you can just fetch on the server using one line of code, await fetch. It is awesome. If you've not tried React Server components, I absolutely recommend kicking the tires on them in Next.js. It's quite compelling. You could also fetch via Apollo, or you could fetch using a loader, using React Routers loaders, or in Remix, they have loaders as well. So that's just a few ways. Another example that I should have put on here is RTK query. That's another great way to go. So in short, if you're using use effect to fetch today in your code base, I'd encourage you to look at some of these tools and ask which one's the best fit for you. If you're using GraphQL, then Apollo is really compelling, but also you can use React Query with Apollo and it works really well. So you don't have to automatically reach for GraphQL tooling just because you're using it. Other tools can handle those things also. Okay.
Cory, do you know this hook from like comics when like someone is on stage and it's a little bit too long? My hook is not long enough to go over to like your house, even though it's just like a 10 minutes drive. But
is this a 30-minute talk, dude?
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, geez, man. I'm sorry.
No,
I'm sorry.
This was a great presentation, and I again really appreciate having you. But we also want to make sure to answer the questions of the folks in the chat. And
Oh man, I had written down 50 minutes. I am embarrassed. My face
You're
is
fine.
red for that. I try to never go long, y'all. Thank you for speaking up. You should have spoken up 10 minutes ago and said, "Hey,
It
grab the
was a
hook."
great presentation, so I didn't feel
Oh,
like jumping in. So,
I'm sorry, guys. Thank you for
no, that was
speaking up. So yeah, I guess I ate into the Q&A time, didn't I?
the good thing is that we had a little bit of chit chat between Khalid and me planned, so we just allocate that time for questions now.
Mhm.
Okay.
I don't like Jan
Khalid,
that much anyways, so
yeah, that's also fair.
uh,
Very,
yeah.
you're using .NET, so
Yeah.
keep cool.
Yeah, so the thing that I saw, um at the beginning you were talking about all the ways to kind of start with React. Um Vite is kind of your recommendation, right? Is if I remember that correctly, right? Starting with Vite.
Well, yeah, I don't know that I'd summarize it that uh, Vite is one of my recommendations.
Mhm.
Yeah.
NX is your proper recommendation that uses Vite under it. That's what you're saying, right? I
You could
I
do
read
that
that
too.
correct
I
between
I
the line.
I forgot to even mention that one, but that's an option too. Yes.
Yeah, I did see in the chat a lot people were kind of like conflating or maybe kind of pitting Next.js and React against each other. Like, hey, don't use this, use that. But
Mm.
I didn't think there was a like their competition there between React and Next.js. Could you clarify kind of where that sentiment may be coming from our audience?
Next.js has a huge amount of political power now because they've hired some React developers, and it
Hmm.
appears that they have a very close relationship now with the React team because of that. And given Meta still employs people working on React too, but there's just been concern that Vercel now holds an inordinate amount of power over React because of that relationship. And I think there's some reason to potentially be concerned there. But on the same token, I love the pace of innovation, and I recognize that what React is trying to accomplish now requires a company like Vercel to be able to provide a full stack story and iterate on these full stack conversations, because React is not just a front end library anymore. There's just more
Hmm.
to it.
Yep. Uh, You also mentioned one of your tips was about like export default. I know Jan has a lot of opinions about export default, so I wanted him to kind of chime in about that in particular. Go ahead, Jan.
You really put me on the spot here.
I did. I did. It
You just bring me on the things that I feel really passionate about, like export default, which I just think are nice for like file-based routing and things like that, where you have to use something like that, and otherwise just don't. There's
Yes. Actually,
some
Jan, you and I
benefit.
agree.
You
I
too.
Yeah,
Right?
I
You're
only
the only
use
one that.
default exports in React components, and I do that because lazy loading requires it, and
Yeah.
because some frameworks expect you to do so because of that very thing. There are ways around it, but frankly, the ways around it feel too tedious to be worth it. I tend to have one component per file, so I think we can be friends.
Yeah, I think so too. We can meet at Q39 for a beer and some barbecue.
Game on.
I guess another thing that people were maybe unsure about. I know we have like different levels of folks with like less experience, more experience. TypeScript is really about typing while you're coding, and you were talking about Zod as well.
Mm.
Um, do you find that doing TypeScript is more important, Zod doing runtime type checking more important, or do you just think they work both hand in hand and folks should kind of adopt both of them?
I think what you said at the end is actually my take, that they absolutely are peanut butter and jelly. They work really well together. Keep in mind that if you declare Zod schemas, they have more power than TypeScript declaratively. There are things you can declare in Zod that you cannot declare in TypeScript. So for example, in Zod, I can say min and max. I can say that this is an email or this is a URL. I can't do that in TypeScript. So if I
Mhm.
declare those schemas, I can derive my types from those Zod schemas. So the two work together quite nicely. That said, if you made me choose, I would choose just TypeScript, but both are wonderful tools that work well together.
Yeah,
On
it's
that note,
Yeah.
Sorry, but I have a much more important question, and I love asking this question because it sounds like you're big into typing. Same here. If you would have to choose between typings and tests, though, and I know this is a silly question, but it's a very funny question in terms of priorities. So, what would you choose?
Oh man, I put this poll on Twitter, and this
Oh, you were. Oh, that's
I
funny.
was the guy that created that poll, and it got
Ah,
unbelievable numbers of responses, and it was 50-50 in the end. It was 49-51, I believe, actually. And the funny thing was, if I remember right, types won, and that surprised me a bit because types do not guarantee that the code actually does what we expect
That's
it to
true.
do. Tests do. But frankly, if I had to choose, I would easily choose types because
Same.
over 20 years, what I found is it's pretty easy to do types well, but most teams really don't do tests that well. Tests are hard to do well. Even after all these years, I struggle because there's just so many headwinds for doing types or tests well. So, and we can even think, okay, we've written lots of tests over here. Well, are they actually testing everything we want? We got to maintain them. There's a lot of cost to it. So that's just my experience.
Yeah.
I fully agree. And I know Paul is taking in the background, not being very happy right now, but totally worth it.
Yeah, I mean, I guess on that note, Cory, thanks so much. It was a great presentation. Folks are going to go back and kind of rewatch it. Definitely taking notes and stuff like that. So thank you so much again for your time.
Before we let you go, because
Yeah.
you went over time, I have to ask you one more question.
Mm.
With all your years of experience with consulting and stuff, I assume you work a lot with junior developers. So what would you recommend people getting into the industry, what's the fastest way to ramp up their knowledge and getting like professional in React and other technologies?
My advice is always the same for people in this front. As somebody that's interviewed people a lot, if you come into an interview and you're able to show me a GitHub repo that you created and you just built something, anything, and you say, here's how I did it, here's what I know, and you go, I'd love to get feedback on it, I want to get better. Like that tells me that you are absolutely serious about getting good. And even if I look at the code and I go, okay, this needs a lot of work, well, okay, you're just getting started at this. You've told me that you are willing to take initiative that most people don't do. It sets you apart in a way that's so powerful. And now we can have a conversation, because when I hire somebody, I'm hiring somebody based on what I think they will be in the future. And that tells me they're likely to grow really quickly.
I like it. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thanks, guys. Have a great day.
Yeah, you
Yeah,
too.
you too.
See ya.